Your son, paid not to resuscitate. The anesthesiologist told me, seconds before taking the anesthesia. My name is Richard Harrison, and I am 68 years old. Throughout my entire life, during 42 years precisely, I had dedicated every hour of my day to building structures. Commercial buildings in Denver that are still standing. Skyscrapers in Boulder that define the city skyline. Bridges that cross rivers and connect communities. Structures that lasted longer than many American marriages, longer than friendships, longer than promises. I was a respected civil engineer, someone who had received national awards for my work, someone whose name appeared on bronze plaques on building facades throughout the state of Colorado. But what I valued most was not any of that steel and concrete structure. What I valued most was my family. Or at least that was what I believed with all sincerity, all purity of heart of a father who had sacrificed everything for his children, who had worked 70 hours a week not out of greed, but out of love, who had lost my first wife, Eleanor, at 56 years old to cancer, and had remained alone since then because I never felt I deserved to be happy again. On that specific Tuesday in October in Denver, Colorado, everything I had built in 68 years collapsed, not like a structure damaged by an earthquake or tornado. It collapsed like a construction whose foundations were undermined from the beginning, like a building that had never had a solid foundation, and I, in all my engineer wisdom, had never seen the cracks that were growing in the internal walls. I received the call from St. Joseph's Medical Center Hospital while I was in my private studio, the one I built on the penthouse of one of my buildings, when I officially retired at 63 years old. I was having breakfast, a coffee brewed in a cloth filter that I prepared religiously every morning, when the phone rings. It was Dr. Patricia Chen, head of the emergency surgery unit. Her voice was professional, but I was good at detecting what was not said verbally. There was tension there. There was urgency. My only son, Marcus, had had a serious car accident on Highway Y-25, near the Brighton exit, a head-on collision. The police were investigating if it had been caused by brake failure or driver error. The parameters were not clear yet. Marcus had been taken by emergency helicopter directly to St. Joseph's because it was the closest hospital with a specialized trauma unit. Marcus was 25 years old. He worked as a financial consultant at a reputable company in Denver, Pinnacle Financial Solutions, a position he had secured a few years ago, largely thanks to the connections I had made through my years as a respected engineer. He was my only son, my living legacy, the reason why I had worked so hard in the last 40 years, often putting my construction projects before my own health, before precious moments. With my wife, Eleanor. Dr. Chen continued speaking. Marcus had multiple rib fractures, a collapsed lung, significant internal bleeding, possible damage to the spinal cord that was still being evaluated. The doctors needed to perform emergency surgery. He was in critical condition. She asked if I could come to the hospital immediately and bring identification documents and insurance information. I let the coffee cup fall. It broke on the studio floor. The coffee spilled over the wooden floor that I had chosen personally. All of this seemed insignificant at that moment. I grabbed the keys to my car, a black 2012 GMC that I kept impeccable, with low mileage because I used it mainly to drive to the architecture office that I still maintained as a consultant. I left the studio without locking the door. It did not matter. I drove in a way I do not even recognize now, in a state of panic that surpassed all reason, all engineer logic. I ran 2 stop signs. I almost collided with a taxi on 16th Avenue. A police officer started following me, but I was so focused on getting to the hospital that I did not even notice. 42 minutes later, I was in the hospital waiting room. Marcus was 25 years old, worked as a financial consultant at a big Denver company. He was my son, my legacy, the reason why I had worked so hard in the last 40 years. My wife, Eleanor, had died 8 years ago from cancer. Since then, Marcus had become everything to me. Or that was what I thought. I met Dr. Patricia Chen waiting for me with a serious expression in her eyes. She explained that Marcus had multiple rib fractures, a collapsed lung, and significant internal bleeding. They needed to operate immediately. She asked for my authorization for the procedure. I signed the papers with shaking hands. A nurse took me to a special waiting room for family members in critical situations. I sat on an uncomfortable gray plastic chair and waited, and waited. The hours passed like agonizing days. Other family members came in and out constantly. Some left crying inconsolably, others left with visible relief. I remained motionless, completely frozen, praying in silence, something I had not done since Eleanor's death. 5 hours later, Dr. Chen reappeared. Marcus had survived the surgery. His body had resisted. The doctors said he had a strong spirit, an extraordinary will to live. I cried with relief. I held her hand and thanked her sincerely. She smiled, that kind of professional smile that masks something unsaid. I should have paid attention to that smile. Marcus was transferred to the intensive care unit. I could only see him for a few hours a day through a protective glass pane. He was unconscious, connected to tubes, machines beeping constantly. His face was a white mask of pain even while asleep. I spent the next 2 weeks in constant vigil. During those days, I began to notice small strange things. The nurses seemed to avoid my gaze. Dr. Chen never appeared as frequently anymore. When I asked about Marcus's progress, I received vague and imprecise answers. Something was wrong. My engineer instinct, the one that had saved countless lives on construction sites detecting structural problems before they became disasters, was signaling a red alert. In the 3rd week, I received a call from my accountant, Gerald Feynman. He wanted to schedule a meeting with me regarding some important documents that Marcus had asked him to prepare. I was confused. When I was able to leave the hospital, I drove to his office in Cherry Creek, an elegant area of Denver. Gerald was sitting behind a dark mahogany desk when I entered. He had an uncomfortable expression, the one you see when someone needs to say something they do not want to say. He coughed, adjusted his glasses, and offered me coffee. I refused. According to Gerald, Marcus had removed me as beneficiary of several of my investments 4 years ago. My property in Bear Mountain, valued at $2,200,000, had been legally transferred to a limited liability company that Marcus controlled. My stock portfolio, which totaled over $900,000, had been transformed into a trust agreement that named Marcus as administrator with discretionary distribution rights. And my main house in Denver, where I lived for 35 years while building my life, had been refinanced 5 times in the last 3 years, with lines of credit that Marcus had opened in my name. My world began to spin. I asked Gerald to verify this information again. He handed me a thick folder with documents, signatures that looked like mine, but that I did not remember signing. Impenetrable legal writing that had robbed me of everything while I slept at night. Confident, naive, a father who loved his son more than himself. I returned to the hospital in a state of shock. I asked security to let me into the intensive care unit outside of visiting hours. I needed to talk to Marcus, awake or not. His eyes opened when I entered. There was a slight clarity in them. I whispered his name. He tried to speak, but the endotracheal tube in his throat prevented him. I squeezed his hand so hard that the nurse had to ask me to stop. I left the room in tears. My son, my only son, the one I had sacrificed everything to raise, had betrayed me so deeply that I could barely process it. In the following days, I began to investigate further with the methodical, systematic approach of an engineer. I hired a private investigator named Tom Belmont. He was a tough man, with deep scars on his face and a direct way of speaking that allowed no illusion or false comfort. Tom had worked for the federal police for 22 years before retiring to open his own investigation business. I spent $2 million in legal retainers and comprehensive investigations to discover the complete truth about what had happened to me. Tom discovered devastating information that left me breathless. Marcus had become involved in a deep and dangerous way with his girlfriend, a woman named Vanessa Carlisle, a 23-year-old woman from an extraordinarily wealthy family in Boulder, Colorado. Vanessa had an uncomfortable history of relationships with older men, usually rich men with significant assets. Tom had investigated her background completely and discovered that she had even studied family law specifically to learn how to legally separate divorced men from their fortunes accumulated during life. Marcus had become completely obsessed with Vanessa in a way that suggested severe emotional control. He was willing to do absolutely anything to impress her, to gain her approval, to keep her happy. This included committing fraud against his own father, his protector, his progenitor. But there was something even more sinister. Tom discovered through hospital sources that Marcus had been in contact with Dr. James Whitmore, an anesthesiologist at St. Joseph's Hospital. He had sent 2 payments of $100,000 each to a Cayman account belonging to Whitmore. The date records showed that the payments were made on the same day Marcus had come out of the coma. That day he had woken up with that momentary clarity. I asked Tom to investigate that specific detail even more deeply. A week later, he called me to his office located in a nondescript building in the low-high neighborhood in Denver, with an expression that was grave, serious, relentless. He had managed to get a copy of an audio from a security camera in the preoperative room from that fateful day. Someone had made sure there were permanent recordings of that moment, and Tom had paid a lot of money, much more than should be necessary, to obtain them confidentially. He placed professional headphones on my ears and pressed play. It was Dr. Whitmore's voice speaking to Marcus days before the surgery. Whitmore had called Marcus the night before the accident. They discussed details in a low voice, but the audio was clear enough. Whitmore confirmed that during the surgery, he would ensure that Marcus received a specific dose of medications that would keep his body alive, but his brain dead. Brain death. A man in a body that breathed, but without consciousness, without legal responsibility, without memory of crimes committed. With a neurologically dead man, guardianship would fall to the closest relative, me. As legal guardian of an incapacitated person, I would have access again to the financial assets. Or that was how Marcus and Whitmore expected it to work. But there was a plan B in the audio. If something went wrong during the surgery, if Marcus's body did not survive, Whitmore would execute what he called alternative protocols. He would make sure I never discovered the truth. At that moment, sitting in Tom's office with shaking hands, I understood the last part of the plan. Marcus's car accident had not been an accident. It was a contract execution, organized so that he could fulfill his role in the farce. If I had not arrived at the hospital in time, if I had waited an hour longer, my son would have died at the hands of a criminal doctor. Just hours before Marcus was taken to surgery, seconds before he breathed the anesthesia, something extraordinary had happened. A nurse named Sarah Mitchell, a 37-year-old woman who had worked in the surgery unit of the hospital for 12 years, had entered the preoperative room. She had suspected something wrong when Whitmore began to insert unregistered medications into Marcus's intravenous drip. She asked Dr. Whitmore about the medications. He smiled in a sinister way and whispered to her that he had been paid to ensure that Marcus would not wake up. Confused, Sarah asked what he meant. Whitmore, in a moment of arrogance, explained almost the entire plan. He had been paid to induce brain death during surgery. A functioning body, but a dead brain. He said it was simple work, that he had done worse things for less money, that no one would ever find out because the medications he was using left little toxic trace and the body would show only natural death. At that moment, according to what Sarah told me personally a week later, something inside her broke. She had lost her own mother in a hospital in Fort Collins 5 years earlier, when a negligent doctor made a mistake and no one held anyone accountable. She had entered nursing to save lives, not to watch them be taken away. Sarah activated the emergency alarm. She called security. Whitmore tried to leave the room but was detained. In the chaos that followed, the surgery was postponed, and a different surgeon, a man named Dr. Robert Patterson, who had absolute integrity, took over the case. It was Patterson who performed the surgery that actually saved Marcus's life. But there was a small detail. When the surgery was happening, when Patterson was rebuilding Marcus's ribs and repairing the collapsed lung, he discovered something interesting. There were cigarette burn marks on parts of Marcus's body that could not have been caused by the car accident. Old marks, healed, but still visible to an experienced surgeon. Patterson took photos and kept them confidentially. He suspected that the accident had been intentional, that someone had hurt my son on purpose. He reported his suspicions to the police after the operation ended. The detectives began to investigate. Meanwhile, the Denver police were also investigating Dr. Whitmore simultaneously. Sarah had made a statement under full and detailed oath about what he had openly confessed in the preoperative room. With that statement, in addition to the payments in the Cayman account that Tom had discovered, there was probable cause for an arrest. Whitmore was arrested 3 days later after trying to flee to Mexico. But while all this was happening, Marcus woke up. Not completely. Not immediately. It took 2 additional weeks, but he woke up. His eyes opened. He looked at me in his hospital bed and asked where he was. He did not remember anything after he had gotten into the car to drive to the hospital on that day of the accident. His memory had been erased by the anesthesia, by the medications, by the traumas. I had to tell him everything. I felt as if I were destroying a life again, but this time conscious that I was right. Marcus cried in a way I had never seen him cry before, not even as a child, and he had hurt himself badly in a bicycle accident at 8 years old. He cried with the kind of absolute despair that comes only when the entire illusion of one's own life disintegrates simultaneously. He admitted everything eventually, between sobs and tears, the constant pressures from Vanessa on him, his blind love for her that had completely surpassed reason, his almost pathological desperation to impress her, to gain her approval, to keep her interested in him, the access he had obtained to my financial documents through passwords he had gotten when he came home on weekends, the corporate lawyers Vanessa had hired to structure the fraud in a way that was practically impossible to trace, and yes, the explicit contact with Dr. James Whitmore through intermediaries. He said he had tried to back out days before the accident. He said he had asked Whitmore to cancel the plan, but Whitmore said he had already been paid for the services and that Marcus had two options: comply with the agreement or disappear. Marcus had tried to tell Vanessa he could not do it anymore, that it had gone too far. She reacted with fury. Vanessa had hired someone for the accident. Marcus admitted this between sobs. She wanted him out of the way temporarily, in a state of brain death while she consolidated control of the properties. There was a second pattern in the plan, with a term of 18 months. After I died naturally, everything would pass completely to Vanessa through Marcus, even if he were in a vegetative state. That night, I stayed awake breathing deeply, trying to process how my own son had conspired with a woman to rob me, and when that did not work, to kill me and leave him like a puppet in a hospital bed for life. The fury I felt was lava in my veins. But there was also something else. There was an opportunity, a chance to do things the right way, the way a man who had spent his life building solid structures should do. I hired a criminal defense lawyer named David Rothstein. He was a 55-year-old man with gray hair and an always impeccable suit. Rothstein had a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. I told him everything about Marcus, about the plan, about Whitmore, about Vanessa. Rothstein listened without interrupting. Then he told me something that shocked me. He said that Marcus, technically, had committed fraud, theft, conspiracy to commit homicide, and attempted murder of his own father, even if through third parties. The evidence was solid. The confession was recorded. The fake financial documents signed by me were irrefutable. Rothstein recommended that I simply let Marcus rot in prison. He said that was what most parents did. But I was not most parents. I still loved Marcus. Or at least I loved the boy he had been, before Vanessa. I asked Rothstein to negotiate with the prosecutor. There was a way to do this so that all the guilty parties were punished, but Marcus had a chance at rehabilitation, a chance at life. Rothstein worked for 3 months. He negotiated agreements with the prosecution. In exchange for Marcus turning against Vanessa and Whitmore and testifying completely in court, Marcus would receive a reduced sentence. Prison, yes. But not in jail for life. 5 years, with the possibility of parole after 3.5 years with good behavior. Rothstein also negotiated that Marcus complete a comprehensive emotional addiction recovery program while incarcerated. Vanessa Carlisle was prosecuted for conspiracy to commit homicide, financial fraud, and aggravated theft. The trial lasted 4 months. During the trial, Marcus testified against her. Seeing him on the witness stand, in a temporary prison uniform, telling the truth about his crimes, was the hardest thing I had ever done. But it was necessary. Vanessa was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Dr. James Whitmore was convicted of attempted aggravated homicide, conspiracy to commit homicide, professional fraud, and violation of the Hippocratic Oath. He received 22 years in federal prison, and his medical license was permanently revoked. His career ended in a prison cell. Sarah Mitchell, the hero nurse who had interrupted the criminal plan, received a $5,000 award from the hospital administration and a letter of commendation in her permanent professional record. She continued working as a nurse, but now at another hospital in Boulder, and I hired her as a wellness consultant to manage my personal health. During the following 2 years, I visited Marcus at the federal prison in Fort Collins every month, religiously, as a devoted father always would. We saw a family counselor named Dr. Michael Waters, a man who specialized in cases of family betrayal and rehabilitation of criminals. Little by little, we rebuilt something that could be called a genuine relationship. It was not what we had before, that innocence of father and son. That period had passed forever, but it was something new, something more authentic perhaps, based on brutal honesty, Marcus's genuine remorse, and a conditional forgiveness on my part. Marcus concluded his recovery program with distinguished praise. His prison supervisors reported consistently that he had become an exemplary model for other inmates, working as the institution's librarian and education tutor. He had even started writing a book about his crimes, his fall from grace, and his redemption that would eventually be published, with all earnings destined for charitable purposes, helping victims of financial fraud committed by family members. My financial portfolio was completely restored through successful legal actions. The forged documents Marcus had created were legally annulled in court. The Bear Mountain property, the one worth $2,200,000, was returned to my name and my full control. The main house in Denver was refinanced under my own favorable terms, with my new bank offering an interest rate that was practically a courtesy for my lifelong professional reputation. I did not suffer final financial loss, largely because I had kept a second financial portfolio that no one knew about, conservative investments in physical gold, and American Treasury bonds that my accountant Gerald had kept secretly and prudently during all these turbulent years. It was a protection that I had instinctively created as an engineer who understood structural contingencies. Always have a backup foundation when you build something important. When Marcus left federal prison after serving 3 years and 2 months of his sentence, with early release for exemplary good behavior, I was waiting for him in the penitentiary complex parking lot with my car. He was a completely different man from the one who had entered behind those walls. He had lost weight during incarceration. His face was thinner and hardened by reality. His eyes looked like the eyes of a man 20 years older. But there was something redeeming in them too. There was real, deep remorse, not the superficial variety that criminals fake for parole boards. It was a regret that came from the depths of his soul. He got into the car, and we sat in silence for a full minute. The only sound was the air conditioning running and the distant sounds of Denver traffic. Then Marcus looked directly into my eyes and said one thing that I will never forget as long as I breathe. A phrase that encapsulates everything about redemption and human transformation. He said that during that emergency surgery, when Dr. James Whitmore had whispered those cruel and calculated words about paying not to resuscitate, in that specific moment before the anesthesia completely took over his consciousness, he had thought of me. He had thought of every day I had spent on construction sites, building structures that would last for decades, while he had wasted his youth trying to destroy our family structure with greed and selfish madness. And in that moment, suspended between life and death, he had finally understood that life was immensely bigger than money, than immediate satisfaction, than any woman, than any passing obsession. We drove through the city of Denver in contemplative silence, leaving the past behind while the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, creating a spectacle of gold and red on the western horizon. Marcus had paid his debt to society. Now the true work of paying the debt to himself and to me would begin, day after day, year after year, through meaningful actions and not just regretful words. My life had been built like a complex building, with various foundations and multiple levels of support structure. When the cracks began to appear visible, when the structure began to collapse like a game of fragile cards, I did not demolish everything hastily in anger and revenge. I rebuilt, carefully, methodically, one floor at a time. A man who spent his entire life building never gives up repairing something that was fundamentally damaged. He just waits with patience, keeps his unquestionable faith, and rebuilds better, stronger, more enduring than it was before. He learns that structural flaws can be repaired, that foundations can be reinforced, that even a nearly destroyed building can be saved.